As I mentioned on Sunday, and then briefly mentioned in yesterday's video, Paul is writing about the law, but he uses this idea of a marriage metaphor to talk about the fact that we are separated from the law when we die, just as a spouse is separated from a spouse when they die. The binding, the being bound together, is no longer applicable upon the death of one spouse or the other. Now, Romans chapter 7, verses 1 through 3 are pretty straightforward, and I went through most of this on Sunday, but I want to just give a little bit more clarity to this idea that we find in these first verses of Romans chapter 7. First off, people are bound to laws only while they live. Secondly, a woman is bound to her husband only while they are alive. Third, if the husband dies, then the woman is no longer bound to the husband. And fourth, if the woman does try to bind herself to someone else while her husband is living, she commits adultery. Now, again, in our culture, I understand that every time I used her and husband, we could say husband or wife going both ways. Paul, again, has written these words this way because of the audience that is his primary audience, and that is the Jewish Christian related to this text. So these verses, again, are simple enough, but culturally, again, they create a problem. So let me just kind of break these cultural things out. Again, in our culture, we would say that the husband and the wife are bound to one another. Divorce is not a part of God's plan. Jesus makes this clear in Matthew 19:6, for instance. Malachi, the prophet Malachi, says that God hates divorce. We see that in Malachi 2:16. But God did allow divorce because of the hardness of the people. That's very clear in the Matthew 19 or the Mark 10 passage, for instance. However, I should say thus, the law did state that a man could divorce his wife, but a woman could not divorce the husband. That was what was understood by the Jewish law. We see that in Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 1 through 4, for instance. The law was still applicable to the Jews of Paul's day, and again, that was his key audience, his target audience for this entire part where he's been talking about the law. Now, again, as I mentioned on Tuesday, in the first century in Rome, a female could divorce her husband just as the husband could divorce his wife. So it was different culturally to the Roman, and that's why, again, I think we can very clearly see that Paul's primary target to the Roman church at this point still is the Jewish audience. So, the second point I want to make is Israel was absolutely familiar with the idea of adultery. Of course, God gave a command against adultery. It is the seventh of the 10 commandments that is given. But more than that, Israel, as a nation, was guilty of committing adultery. God uses the imagery of adultery to condemn Israel and their idolatry. God says that when you are idolatrous and worshiping other idols, worshiping other gods through idols, you are committing adultery towards me. We see this clearly in passages such as Ezekiel chapter 6, verse 9, and much of Ezekiel chapter 16, verses 14 through 63. We also see this in the opening chapters of Hosea, where Hosea is representing God and his wife Gomer, who continually goes back to a life of prostitution, of selling herself to the highest bidder, so to speak, just as the Israelites were selling themselves to another god, so to speak. That is what is captured in the first few chapters of the book of Hosea. So Israel would have very well known the idea of adultery and how they fit into that picture. The third thing I want to mention is not really covered in this passage, but I think it's important, and we don't find it directly here, but I think we could allude to it because it does talk about this adulterous aspect. If we are released from the law as our husband, meaning if we have died to ourselves, and we have embraced Christ, and Jesus is our new husband, we are the bride of Christ, then we are released from the law as our husband, then because we are following Jesus, because we are married to Jesus, when we try to return to the law we are committing adultery against Jesus. We kind of see this in Galatians chapter 5, the beginning of that infamous chapter, where Paul writes, "For freedom, Christ has set us free." And what he's saying is you've already been set free. Don't go back and try to live according to something that you've already been freed from. So, if we are seeking salvation in a place it cannot be found, meaning with the law, we are not truly giving ourselves, trusting our lives to the one who has actually made salvation possible. So again, Romans chapter 7, verses 1 through 3 is fairly easy to understand on that point. And I hopefully have provided a little bit more clarity of what Paul was trying to get at. But when we add verse 4, this analogy fails. In Romans 7, 2 and 3, the idea is that the husband dies, and if the husband dies, the wife is free to remarry. But in verse 4, it is we, the bride, who have died. Again, I've said this in Sunday's sermon video. But the death of which Paul speaks is a spiritual death into Christ. We see that in verse 4. We also see that in chapter 6, verses 3 through 5, and in verse 11 from chapter 6. But it is not the husband who has died. That would presume that Christ did not only die, but that he is still dead. But again, we know from Romans 6, 11, and those other verses I just mentioned, that Christ is not dead. We know that from the Gospels. We know that from elsewhere in the New Testament. And if Jesus is the new husband, then it stands to reason that the law is the former husband. And if the law has not died and Jesus is alive, then it is in full force. The law is still in full force for all who remain bound to it. Therefore, verse 4 has a disconnect from verses 2 and 3. And this disconnect has caused a great deal of debate among Christians for centuries. In fact, many people have looked at this to try to find a loophole so that it would say that God allows divorce. But marriage is not the focus here. As I said yesterday, the word law is used 8 times in this passage. And if you add written code, there's 9 references to the law, to the Mosaic law. The law is the emphasis here, not the order of marriage. Again, I wish I knew what Paul's intention was here. Other people certainly probably want to know that more than I do, but I don't think we're going to care when we have a chance to stand before Jesus and say, hey, can somebody explain Romans chapter 7, verse 4 to me and what Paul was thinking? What is certain, what we must take from this is that we are bound. And that binding is to the law unless we ourselves have died to ourselves and embraced the opportunity to be bound to Jesus instead. So what this passage helps us to understand is that there are confusing passages in the Bible. And if verse 4 challenges your understanding, just wait till the rest of chapter 7, because it's about to get really fun. But we'll talk about that more next week. For now, just understand that God has a plan. God has a purpose. It is working out perfectly. And a part of that plan is for us to no longer be bound to the law, but to instead bind ourselves to Christ.